Hello and welcome to this demo on working with the Invoke code activity in UiPath Studio. We'll build an automated process that will check if two text files have the same content by comparing their hash codes. These are generated using the SHA-256 function. Let's begin. We'll start with a new project where we'll add a sequence, give it a descriptive name, and add an annotation explaining what the automation will do. Alright, now let's add two select file activities to the workflow. Then rename the first one to select first file. In it, we'll press Ctrl-K to create a new variable in the output field, which we'll call first file. This variable will store the path of the first file selected. The second activity will be named select second file and will store the path of the second file in a variable called second file path. Great! Now let's add an invoke code activity. It will help us compute the hash code for the first file so that we can later on compare it with the one of the second file. Let's give it a name that reflects this. Now we just need the piece of code to be invoked. So we'll go to our code source. This is the code that generates the hash code for our files. We'll copy the code, go back to our invoke code activity, open the code editor, and paste it. To make sure that it will work, we'll remove the first three lines. The first line is the method or procedure's signature. The invoke code activity doesn't support functions, procedures, or methods. The second line is the declaration of the file path variable. We'll replace it with an input argument and map the argument to a variable. The third line is the declaration of the result variable. We'll replace this one too with an output argument and map the value to a variable. We'll also remove the last line as it marks the end of the method or procedure. All good so far? Let's add the input and output argument to the invoke code activity. First, we'll add the in parameter called first file path of type string and map it to the first file path variable. Then the second parameter result with the out direction and type string will be mapped to the first file hashcode argument. Let's add a log message activity to print the first file hashcode. This will have the log level set to info and the message first file hash signature plus the value of the first file hashcode variable. We'll repeat the process to generate a hash code for the second file. We'll add a new invoke code activity, rename it, and simply copy the code from the first activity. Next, we'll create the input and output arguments and map them to the corresponding variables for the second file. And, as before, we'll add a log message activity to print the hash signature for the second file. Perfect! Now, let's check if the compared files are identical or different. Let's add an if activity to our sequence and rename it to if same hashcode. We'll set up the following condition: file hashcode equals second file hashcode. If the condition is true, we'll need a log message to display the files are identical. Now let's copy the same log message, add it in the else section, and modify it to the content of the files is different. And it looks like we're done with the workflow. It's time to test it. Let's click Run and see what happens. In this first run, we'll compare test file 1 with test file 2. We already know that the content of the file is different, and as we can see in the output panel, the workflow has returned the correct result. Let's try another file pair. More precisely, files 1 and 3. In this case, we know that the files are identical. And once again, our workflow returned the correct result. It identified that the files are identical. Let's have a quick look at the test files. Test file 1 has test file 1 written inside it. Test file 2 has test file 2, but the test file 3 has test file 1. The hash signatures generated by test file 1 and test file 3 are the same, as the content within them is identical, whereas the hash signature from file 2 is different, as the content is different from the other files. Great! Our project works as expected. Before we end the video, let's quickly recap what we've learned in this demo. The invoke code activity helped us in computing the hash code for each processed file. We compared the file's hash code using an if activity and logged the messages into the output panel via log message activities. An important point to remember is that the invoke activity doesn't support functions, procedures, or methods. So, make sure you remove any code lines associated with them to avoid any errors at runtime. And this was it. Thanks for watching and happy automation!